Hello and welcome to the next chapter. We're going to talk about fiscal policy, the government, and the macroeconomy. This is how much we spend, what we spend on, where we get our taxes from, where does the revenue come in, and then how does the government intervene during an economic crisis? So what is the economics on why government should intervene in a market? First, governments need to provide public goods. This is when the public benefits are bigger than the private benefits. So the private sector will not have the incentive to provide enough of it. These are things such as roads, education, science, and national defense. Now, all of these things have a private counterpart. There are private roads, there's private investment in science, there's private schools, you have private security forces, but they're all smaller and underfunded relative to the total public economic value they provide for the entire economy. Therefore, we need a government to provide the service that everybody enjoys, regardless of whether they pay for it or not. Governments also provide social insurance. This is when you pool the risk at a higher level, maybe at the state level or even a national level. Such things like Social Security, retirement insurance for the elderly, unemployment insurance, or health insurance. When more and more people contribute to the risk pool, the individual costs decrease. It can become more economically efficient to do it at the government level. And finally, there's a role for the government to intervene and help mitigate economic crises. Now, the federal government gets most of the attention, most of the headlines, and most of our eyeballs pay attention to what happens in Washington, D.C. However, a full 38% of government spending is done at the state and local level. That's $4 trillion worth. But it's not getting 38% of our attention. But from an economic perspective, perhaps we should pay attention to it more. And we'll do that. We're going to explore both what happens at the federal level as well as the state and local level. Just speaking for the federal government, it has largely been characterized as an organization that provides social insurance with a security force. Let's look at each individual component, and we see that Social Security comes in at number one by a mile. Well over $1.3 trillion is spent every year to help mitigate poverty for the elderly and provide that retirement social benefit. The next component is healthcare. This section is largely comprised of Medicaid, as well as other health subsidies. Medicare for the elderly is the third component. Number 4, we have income security. All three of these are hovering at around $800 billion a year each. Income security is going to be things like unemployment insurance, housing subsidies, food stamps, and other welfare programs. Once we count vet benefits, the total comes to 66.5% of federal government spending is devoted to helping the vulnerable and taking care of the sick. National defense comes in at 13% of total federal government spending. That is a large single component, but it pales into how much the federal government helps taking care of people. The next chunk is the interest payments going to service the debt. This is around 10%. And then everything else combined, we're talking transportation, commerce, community development, justice, the FBI, international affairs. So that's both the humanitarian aid that goes abroad as well as the foreign military aid. I mean, the Ukraine portion of this is just a tiny sliver. The environment, so the EPA or other natural resources like natural parks. All of federal government science spending. So NASA is just like a half of that at $25 billion. General government expenditure, as well as agricultural subsidies. All of that combined is only around 10% of total federal spending. 80% of federal government spending is social insurance and a military. So when there are debates about we need to cut back spending, if you're going to do it in any meaningful capacity, you'll have to discuss social insurance. And then you have to ask a second question. Is cutting social insurance the most economically appropriate thing to do? And people debate that according to their value systems, as well as questions of economic efficiency. Next, let's discuss state and local expenditures. Education is the largest component here, 27% of state and local spending, K through 12, higher education. And then at 24%, we have welfare and the state component of unemployment insurance. Spending on state and local hospitals and other health services, about 9%. State and local employee retirement benefits is a significant portion, 8.6%. Utilities, water, electricity, sewage also comes in around 8%. Public safety, so that would be firemen, policemen, and correction facilities. Transportation, the local roads, the state and local roads are 5.8%. Now, there is an interest component at the state and local level. State and local governments do not run deficit spending like the federal government does. However, they can take out bonds that are associated with schools or hospitals, a particular building, and they'll pay some interest servicing that. Finally, parks and the environment, 2%, and then local housing subsidies at a little over 1%. Adding all of this government spending up, we find that all of the income security is around a third, 30%. We're talking $3 trillion a year is devoted to helping out the most vulnerable. This is a huge component of what our government does. The second is all of the health, we're talking 23%. And then finally, education, 11%. National defense comes in at number 4, 8%. So we spend more on educating people than we do on military and bullets. The interest component's at 7%. This has been rising lately. And then everything else. I want to talk a little bit about science at the bottom, 0.4%. This is a tiny component of what the government spends on. We used to spend more on NASA, say during the space race 50 years ago. And the argument can be made that most long-run economic prosperity comes through technological innovation. Clearly, there is a public good component to perhaps spending more on science. Now, this gets into an interesting question. What is the proper share of spending to each one? What should the economy do? Of course, this will depend on your value systems, but there is undoubtedly a trade-off between who we tax, how much taxation we do, and what we spend on. Should that spending go towards income security, or should more of that spending go towards science, green innovation and infrastructure, better preservation of our natural resources and parks, as well as higher spending on education? There's a big question of whether the government is getting bigger and bigger as the years go by. Well, let's look at the data and find out. It's not a hard question to answer. If we look at spending as a share of GDP, we find over time it has been relatively stable. State and local spending did increase in the 50s and 60s from 10% to 15% of GDP, but has remained flat there since around the mid-1970s. Federal spending has bounced around 20 to 25%. We do see a few temporary bumps. The financial crisis brought in increased stimulus spending, and of course the COVID stimulus was far bigger, and we see the 2 rounds of it. However, we see that it was very temporary, and government spending fell back to the historically normal levels afterwards. Now there's this meme that this is the reason why America doesn't have free healthcare. But is this true? Again, we can just measure it and find out. Over the past 70 years, military spending as a share of economic activity has been in decline. We see during World War II, it was well over 35% of the entire economy was devoted to the war effort. It goes down after the war and bumps back up during the Korean War at 15% of GDP, and then continues a long decline down. Of course, there's a bump up during the Vietnam War, another rise during the 1980s Reagan Cold War military buildup, and then declines with a small rise during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Today, it is far less than 5% of GDP. And on the other hand, we have increased our spending on social insurance, on taking care of the most vulnerable. We have made this trade-off between producing less bullets and helping people out more with healthcare and other income support. We see the passage of certain monumental bills, such as Medicaid and Medicare in 1964 under the Democrat President Lyndon B. Johnson. And we also see a rise in the early 2000s under the Republican President George W. Bush, who expanded Medicare to include prescription payments. The Affordable Care Act was passed just after the financial crisis, and we do see 2 temporary bumps of increased unemployment insurance during the very large recessions of 2008 and 2020. So, what do you all think? Is this pattern going to continue? Will we continue to see less military spending over the next 30 years and more social insurance spending? Or will things change? And should it be this way? Let me know in the comments. Now, I gotta take a word about a political distinction. This thing here, mandatory versus discretionary expenditure, this has very little to do with the economy. Congress decides to split the budget into two components for political purposes. First is the mandatory component. This is auto-renewed, it's written down in law, and it doesn't change. This is spending like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. It's the biggest part of the government, and it's not part of government spending that gets debated year in and year out. The next part is discretionary. Military spending is the largest bit. Along with everything else, these are the debates that make the news. Now, sometimes military gets a lot of attention because it's the biggest component, but as we've just learned, it's only 13% of what the federal government spends on. Most of that 66% is part of the mandatory spending. That's why any major reform to what the federal government spends on will require discussions related to Social Security and other healthcare. Now, how does the U.S. government spending compare to the rest of the world? It's right near the middle. The US, the world, Brazil. This is a graph of just a handful of representative countries. Some countries' governments are very large relative to the economy, around 50% for France and Greece, and some are relatively small, like Bangladesh and Indonesia. Now, we don't find a super strong pattern. On the one hand, your government can't be too small. The smallest governments out there are also some of the poorest countries. So you have to have a sufficiently large government to provide infrastructure, defense, spending on education, public health, so everybody can work well in an economy. And some governments, like South Korea and New Zealand, have a relatively small government relative to the economy and yet relatively high incomes. And other countries, particularly those right after the fall of the USSR, had very large governments but relatively low income levels. In the end, what we see is you need a government that's big enough. But exactly how big, there's not a general rule. Some countries, like the Nordic countries, Denmark and Sweden, have relatively large governments and very high incomes. So there's a whole range of choices available to the government and the public to make according to various economic trade-offs and value systems.